The luxurious first-class lounge at Los Angeles International Airport was a world of its own. Soft jazz played in the background, the air smelled of freshly brewed espresso and expensive cologne, and the hushed conversations were spoken in the practiced elegance of the wealthy. Mary Thompson sat with perfect posture in a plush leather chair, her designer handbag placed strategically on the seat next to her, an unspoken barrier between her and any unwanted company. She barely glanced at the people around her. They were all the same, business executives, socialites, old money, and new money trying desperately to blend in. This was her world. She belonged here. When the boarding announcement for first class was made, Mary rose gracefully, smoothing the fabric of her tailored navy blue suit. She walked toward the gate, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. As she approached her seat, 4A, a window seat, as always, she noticed something that made her pause. A black man was already seated in 4B. For a fraction of a second, her mind struggled to place him in this setting. He was dressed impeccably, better than some of the men she'd done business with. His navy suit was perfectly tailored, his watch subtle but undoubtedly expensive. And yet, something felt off. He doesn't belong here. Mary hesitated, then turned sharply toward the nearest flight attendant. A blonde woman in her mid-40s with a practiced smile approached her immediately. "Miss Thompson, how can I assist you?" Mary's voice was low but firm. "I believe there's been a mistake." She cast a pointed glance at the man in 4B. "That gentleman may be in the wrong seat." The flight attendant blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Oh, well, let me check." She turned to the man. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" The man exhaled softly, as if unsurprised by the request. Without a word, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his ticket, handing it over. The attendant studied it, her lips parting slightly in surprise before she looked back at Mary. "There's no mistake," she said carefully. "Mr. Carter is seated in 4B, exactly as assigned." Mary felt a strange heat rise to her face. Her heartbeat quickened, but she maintained her composure. "There must be some misunderstanding," she insisted, her voice tightening. "Are you sure that's correct?" The man, Mr. Carter, finally spoke. His voice was deep, smooth, and unwavering. "She's sure." Mary turned to him fully for the first time, startled by his steady gaze. His dark eyes held no anger, only an unsettling calmness, as if he had seen this happen 100 times before. "I don't see why this is an issue, miss." He tilted his head slightly, waiting for her to fill in the blank. She straightened. "Thompson. Mary Thompson." "Miss Thompson," he repeated, nodding once. "Well, as you heard, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." He gestured toward her seat. "You, however, are blocking the aisle." A few passengers had turned their heads by now, sensing the tension. Mary's skin prickled with embarrassment. She wanted to say something else, to prove she hadn't just assumed he didn't belong, but what could she say? With a forced smile, she nodded stiffly and sat down. She felt the weight of his presence beside her, an unwelcome reminder that she had made a scene. The humiliation burned in her chest. The flight attendant, still trying to smooth over the situation, offered an apologetic smile. "Would either of you like a pre-flight drink?" "A scotch neat," James Carter said easily, not looking at Mary. She hesitated. "A white wine," she finally muttered. As the attendant walked away, silence settled between them. Mary could feel her own pulse in her ears. Then, James spoke again, his tone conversational, as if nothing had happened. "What line of business are you in, Miss Thompson?" She hesitated. "Real estate," she said finally. He nodded thoughtfully. "Boston, right?" Her stomach clenched. "Yes." He took a sip of his scotch, studying her over the rim of his glass. Then he said something that made her blood freeze. "Your husband's in business too, isn't he?" Mary turned to him sharply. "How do you know that?" James smiled, slow and deliberate. "I've met him before." Something about the way he said it, calm, controlled, made her uneasy. Before she could respond, the flight attendant returned with their drinks, forcing her to mask a reaction with a polite nod. She gripped the stem of her wine glass tightly. Who was this man? And how did he know her husband? For the first time that evening, Mary Thompson felt truly out of her depth. The plane had reached cruising altitude, but Mary's pulse hadn't settled. She took small sips of her wine, trying to maintain an air of composure, but her mind raced. James Carter knew her husband. That fact alone sent an uneasy current through her body. Charles Thompson was a real estate mogul, aggressive in business and relentless in negotiations. He had built his empire through power plays, undercutting competitors, and forming strategic alliances with the right people. But for all his success, Charles was selective about who he dealt with. And now this man, this James Carter, sat next to her with an air of quiet control, as if he held some unseen advantage. Mary turned slightly toward him, her voice carefully measured. "You said you've met my husband before." James didn't rush to answer. He took another sip of his scotch, savoring the taste, as if her question was merely background noise. Then he set his glass down on the tray table and met her gaze. "I did," he confirmed. Mary forced a polite smile. "May I ask in what context?" A flicker of amusement passed through his eyes, but his expression remained unreadable. "Let's just say we've done business before." Mary's grip tightened around the stem of her wine glass. That wasn't an answer. She opened her mouth to press further, but at that moment, the flight attendant returned with a warm, practiced smile. "Mr. Carter, Miss Thompson, would you care for dinner? Tonight's options are filet mignon or herb-crusted salmon." James leaned back in his seat, appearing completely at ease. "Filet, medium rare." Mary hesitated for half a second before answering. "Salmon." The attendant nodded and disappeared again, leaving them in their uneasy silence. James exhaled lightly, rolling his shoulders as if settling in for the long haul. "You seem tense, Miss Thompson." Mary's posture stiffened. "I'm perfectly fine." "Are you?" He raised an eyebrow. "You've been gripping that wine glass like you're expecting it to disappear." Her fingers immediately relaxed, but she didn't look away. "I just don't like surprises." James chuckled under his breath. "That makes two of us." The way he said it, slow, deliberate, sent a strange discomfort through her. After a pause, he leaned slightly toward her. "Tell me, Miss Thompson, do you believe in fairness in business?" Mary blinked at the sudden shift in conversation. "Excuse me." "Fairness," he repeated smoothly. "Equal opportunities. The idea that the best person should always win, regardless of background." She hesitated. "Of course." James nodded, tapping a single finger against his glass. "Interesting. Because that's not exactly how your husband operates, is it?" A sharp chill ran down Mary's spine. She squared her shoulders. "I don't know what you're insinuating, but Charles is an excellent businessman." James smiled slightly. "Oh, I don't doubt that." He swirled his scotch, watching the amber liquid move before speaking again. "But he doesn't always play fair. At least, not when it comes to men like me." Mary's stomach twisted. James let the silence settle before continuing. "A few years ago, your husband approached me with a business proposition. A real estate deal that could have been mutually beneficial." He paused. Until he realized who he was dealing with. Mary's lips parted slightly. "I don't." "He changed his mind," James interrupted smoothly. "Decided I wasn't the right fit for his company." No explanation, no negotiation, just a polite but firm dismissal. Mary inhaled sharply. "I'm sure it was just business." James let out a quiet laugh. "Oh, I'm sure that's what he'd say." She hated the way he was looking at her, like he knew something she didn't. "People like your husband don't like to admit when their biases interfere with their decisions," James continued, his voice steady but pointed. "But trust me, I know when I'm being shut out for reasons that have nothing to do with my qualifications." Mary's face burned. She wanted to defend Charles, to insist that he wasn't that kind of man. But could she? Deep down, she knew her husband, knew his views, knew the types of people he trusted in business, and the ones he didn't. James studied her reaction carefully. "So, Miss Thompson, I suppose the real question is, if you had been in his position, would you have done the same?" Mary's throat felt dry. The question wasn't meant to be rhetorical. He was waiting for an answer. Would she have? Of course not. She would have made the deal if it was profitable. But would she have hesitated? Would she have second-guessed him the way she had the moment she saw him in first class? She set her wine glass down carefully, refusing to let her hands shake. I think this conversation is becoming inappropriate. James let out a soft chuckle. Is it? Their meals arrived, breaking the moment. Mary exhaled in relief as the plates were placed in front of them. But the weight of his words still hung in the air. She picked up her fork, but her appetite was gone. James, on the other hand, cut into his steak with ease. He ate calmly, methodically, as if he hadn't just unbalanced her entire evening. Mary stared down at her salmon, her thoughts tangled. The discomfort she felt wasn't just about James. It was about herself. For the first time, she was forced to ask a question she never had before. How much of my success came from the world making room for me and shutting doors on people like him? And she hated that she didn't have an answer. The meal was over, but the bitter taste in Mary's mouth remained. She had barely touched her salmon, her appetite lost somewhere between James Carter's words and the unsettling thoughts unraveling in her mind. She stole a glance at him. He looked completely at ease, reclining in his seat, scrolling through his phone as if their conversation had been nothing more than idle small talk. But Mary knew better. She could still hear his voice, sharp and deliberate. People like your husband don't like to admit when their biases interfere with their decisions. The worst part? She wasn't sure he was wrong. Mary shifted in her seat, crossing her legs, uncrossing them, then adjusting the cuffs of her blazer, anything to distract herself from the gnawing discomfort. She needed control back. "Mr. Carter," she said finally, her voice smooth but measured. James didn't look up immediately. He finished whatever he was reading, then turned to her with an easy smile. "Yes, Miss Thompson." She hated how calm he was, like he already knew he had the upper hand. She kept her expression neutral. "You've made your point very clear. But if you're trying to make me feel guilty on behalf of my husband, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed." James studied her for a moment, then let out a soft chuckle. "Guilt?" He shook his head. "No, Miss Thompson. Guilt doesn't interest me." She frowned. "Then what does?" He leaned slightly toward her, folding his hands together. "Truth." Mary blinked. "Truth." James tilted his head slightly. "You seemed surprised when I told you about your husband's decision. But tell me, are you really surprised?" She stiffened. "I don't." James raised an eyebrow. "Or did you already know, deep down, that Charles Thompson doesn't do business with men like me?" Mary's breath hitched. No, this was ridiculous. Charles was aggressive, yes, but he wasn't. She stopped. Because suddenly, memories surfaced. Dinners at exclusive clubs, where conversations flowed freely among powerful men. The way Charles would lean back in his chair, whiskey in hand, making sharp observations about who was trustworthy and who wasn't. The casual way he dismissed certain people, not based on their talent, but on something unspoken. Mary had never questioned it. Not really. Her silence must have been telling because James gave her a knowing look. "That's what I thought," he murmured. Mary clenched her jaw. "You think you know me, Mr. Carter, but you don't." James smiled slightly. "Maybe not. But I do know this. You didn't hesitate to question if I belonged in first class." Her face burned. "And now," he continued, "you're realizing that the man you share your life with might not be so different from the assumptions you made about me." Her stomach churned. James leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "The real question is, what are you going to do with that truth?" Mary inhaled sharply. "That's none of your concern." James nodded. "You're right. It's not." But the look in his eyes told her that whether she admitted it or not, it was already her concern. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting them both slightly. Mary took it as an excuse to break the conversation, turning toward the window, staring into the vast darkness outside. For the first time in a long time, she felt small. The rest of the flight was quiet. Neither of them spoke again. But Mary knew, when they landed, the real turbulence was just beginning. The wheels of the plane touched down at JFK with a smoothness that Mary barely registered. She had spent the last hour staring at the seat in front of her, lost in thought, replaying James Carter's words over and over in her head. She had entered this flight as Mary Thompson, a woman of privilege and power, unquestioning of the world she navigated. But now, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. As the seatbelt sign flicked off, passengers began gathering their belongings, moving through the aisles with the kind of impatience that always came after a long flight. Mary took her time. She wasn't in a hurry. Not anymore. James stood effortlessly, pulling his carry-on from the overhead compartment with the same quiet confidence he had displayed throughout the flight. And then, to her surprise, he turned to her. "Well, Miss Thompson," he said, voice even, "this was an interesting journey." Mary swallowed, unsure of what to say. She had spent so long being in control of every interaction in her life, and now, for the first time, she felt completely unmoored. But she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Mr. Carter." He studied her for a brief moment. Then, with a small nod, he stepped into the aisle and began walking toward the exit. Mary sat frozen, watching him go. She had a choice. She could stand up, walk off this plane, and pretend none of this had ever happened. She could go home, return to her life, and continue to live in the comfort of her carefully controlled world. Or she could do something different. Something terrifying. With a sharp inhale, she grabbed her purse and stood. By the time she reached the terminal, she spotted him near the baggage claim, scrolling through his phone. Her hands felt clammy, her heart pounding against her ribcage. But she forced herself forward. "Mr. Carter." James glanced up, mildly surprised. "Miss Thompson." She hesitated. And then, before she could overthink it, she spoke. "I was wrong." James raised an eyebrow. "About?" Her throat tightened. "About you." "About a lot of things." A pause. Then, slowly, he tucked his phone into his pocket. Mary swallowed hard. "I don't expect you to care, or to accept any apology I give. But I needed to say it." James studied her carefully, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long moment, he exhaled. "It's not about me accepting it, Miss Thompson." Mary frowned. "Then what is it about?" He held her gaze. "It's about what you do next." Her breath caught. James gave her one last look, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Mary stood there, the weight of his words pressing down on her. Because, for the first time in her life, she didn't know the answer. The ride home was silent. The city lights of New York blurred past the car windows, but Mary barely saw them. James Carter's words still echoed in her mind. "It's about what you do next." She had always believed herself to be an intelligent, capable woman. A woman who made her own decisions, who controlled her own life. But tonight, she felt something she wasn't used to. Uncertainty. When she arrived at her penthouse, Charles was waiting. He was seated in his favorite leather chair, a glass of bourbon in hand, his laptop open on the coffee table. When he saw her, he closed the screen and smirked. "There's my jet-setter," he said smoothly. "How was the trip?" Mary hesitated at the door, watching him. Watching the man she had shared a life with for years. Before, she had never really seen him. Now she did. She crossed the room slowly, setting her purse down on the glass table. "Charles," she said carefully, "do you remember a man named James Carter?" Charles frowned slightly, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Carter. Atlantic Airways." "Yes." His expression darkened slightly. "Yeah, I know him. Arrogant bastard. Thought he could walk into my office and demand a partnership. Didn't like hearing no." He let out a short laugh. "Guys like him think just because they have money, they deserve a seat at every table." Mary's stomach turned. "Guys like him," she repeated. Charles scoffed, swirling his bourbon. "Come on, Mary, don't be naive. You know how this world works." And in that moment, she realized she did. For years, she had ignored it, excused it, pretended it wasn't there. But now, she couldn't. Slowly, she sat down across from him. "What if you were wrong about him?" Charles raised an eyebrow. "What? What if he did deserve that seat at the table?" she pressed. "What if you said no for the wrong reasons?" Charles stared at her for a long moment, then leaned forward, his voice low. "Where is this coming from?" Mary exhaled. She could feel it, the breaking point, the moment that would change everything. "From the fact that I spent an entire flight sitting next to the man you turned away," she said finally. Charles stiffened. Mary met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "And I made the same mistake you did." Silence. Then, Charles scoffed again, leaning back. "Jesus, Mary, you're really letting this get to you." He shook his head. "You're overthinking it." She had told herself that before. Now, she knew better. "No," she said quietly. "I don't think I am." For the first time in her life, Mary Thompson saw the world for what it was. The real question was, what would she do next? She looked at Charles, looked at the life they had built together, and knew she had already made her decision.